Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a fascinating talk on the Titanic and the LGBTQIA heritage that is connected with Belfast's most famous ship. It was fine whenever it left Belfast. The problems only set in after it. I don't think we'll be touching on that, but we're really, really pleased to have Mary Ellen Campbell talking about the queer history of the Titanic. A number of our sessions are recorded, as is this one. So please do look on our YouTube channel and our podcast link for Queer Heritage. We also have an online archive that is an online receptacle. So you don't actually give us anything, you just let us have copies or high quality photographs of images, anything that you think would be valuable to the queers of tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Mary Ellen Campbell for her talk on gays on the Titanic.
Oh, sorry, Jude. There we go. Gays on the Titanic, and it's not gays in the Titanic. So my name is Mary Ellen Campbell, and I'm part of the LGBTQI plus Heritage Project. I'm the Training and Volunteer Officer, along with my colleague Joe Walsh, who is a Development Officer. Gays in the Titanic. This year, on the 8th of March, we celebrated 100 years of activism in the Titanic Belfast. Not on the Titanic, but in the building. And the reason I have this up is because 100 years of activism is very important. We have Cara Friend, who's now just over 50 years old, here and I, that's just over 20, and the Rainbow Project, which is 30. They're not the only organisations that are helping our LGBTQI plus community, but they're the main sector organisations. Our project is part of all three of those organisations, and we're very kindly funded by the National Lottery Heritage Project, or Fund, my mistake. So the Titanic, as Jude says, it's probably one of the most famous ships. It's the most famous ship that left Belfast. It was one of three Olympic class ships. The Olympic, and the third one being the Britannic. They were the largest vessels in the White Star Fleet. At that point, the White Star Fleet had 29 other ships, steamers, and tenders in 1912. The ships began their lives when a discussion happened in mid-1907 between J. Bruce Ismay and the American financier J.P. Morgan. So that's who we're to thank for those three amazing ships. Construction started in August 1908 of the Olympic, and it was simply called number 400, and the Titanic, it was number 401. They were named later, and I know that we have someone who works for Harland and Wolff in the call. I'm sure he understands that number. During the building of the three ships, 6 people died. The Titanic was launched at 12:15 on the 31st of May, 1911. 100,000 people watched her sail down Belfast Lough, and apparently they had to use £2,000 of soap and tallow to get her down the gangway. And a wee twist of fate, and probably something that you may use in a quiz question sometime or in Trivial Pursuits. The Olympic was actually damaged in a collision in September 1911, and 401, the completion was 401 was delayed. Had 401 been finished on earlier, they may have missed colliding with the iceberg. The cost of sailing on the Titanic on her maiden voyage for third class passengers was £7 and 5 shillings, and the first class ranged from £23 to £870. Her maiden voyage began in the 10th of April 1912. So the introduction, visibility of our community in the past. of LGBT individuals has been hidden. We've always existed. And if we don't tell our history, then our history is told by those who sought to oppress us. And in different times in history, probably no more important than it is today. But in all history, it's important that we're there because and it's seen. Our history is often erased. So examining the past and our community's past can help us build a more inclusive narrative, and that can help young people's mental health. Mental well-being is such an important part of what we do when we relook at our heritage. It also gives us the challenges. Sorry, it also, of course, brings challenges in identifying queer individuals in the early 20th century context because it was illegal to be gay. It was illegal to be homosexual. There was a moral panic about our community back in the 1910s, 1911s, 1912s, as there is in some sections of our community today. In 1912, we were criminalised, hospitalised, and very much hidden. Homosexuality was illegal here at home and in the US. I do wonder how many of those people on board the Titanic went off looking for a new life. Were actually going to leave our homes or their homes to find their authentic selves, to live their authentic selves, to be themselves. And this is something we still see today. And today it's actually going the other way. It's like full circle, where we have people coming to live their authentic lives in our homeland. And I want to pay tribute to the sterling work the Rainbow Refugees do. And those people who use that project come here to be themselves. But back then we were still coming out of the Industrial Revolution, where cities' populations had increased. And many gay people had lived double lives or found ways to express their identities in coded or private ways. A young tattooist, Ryan McCann, he's a Belfast lad, and he's just opening a business again. He had a business in town and took a wee while ago, but he's opening his business again, I believe, in Conway Mill. But he was telling me, we were having a conversation one time about sailors' tattoos. Now, I'm not into tattoos, Ryan is, but we were having a yarn about tattoos and the meanings behind them. And he was telling me about one that a lot of sailors would have had on their hands. And I'm lifting my hand, but I'm realizing you can't see me lifting my hand. And just between their thumb and their forefinger, they would have had a spot just in that wee piece of skin. And it was there so that if they kept their hand closed, no one could see it. But if they were indicating to another LGBT person or generally another gay man, that they were gay, they would have opened their hand out. Particularly back in the day where lots of times when people were kind of introducing themselves, they would have been shaking hands and things. It was to actually show other gay men that they were gay. And it's that kind of coded lifestyle. During our heritage tours, and I don't know if any of you have been on them, but again, drop us a wee email and we will put you on the waiting list for the next one. We talk about and in some of our previous history clubs, we also talk about the kind of the influx of people into Belfast after the after the Industrial Revolution, and how that changed gay life in the city. How it kind of made it more open for people. Sorry, whoever came in on the iPhone, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you. So, as I've already said, there's very few direct records of queer people, unless they're police records or newspaper reports of their arrests. But we look for other historical clues. We look to writings, relationships, and social roles to try and find possible connections. And in some of the people we're talking about this evening, we may not have that kind of letter between each of those. But for instance, when we're talking, and we'll be talking about Frank Millet in a second, when we're talking about Frank, there's actually letters that he wrote to his previous lover and letters he wrote about his previous lovers. So those things, those kind of like reading between the lines of letters, of diaries, even photographs, and kind of those people who were challenging social norms are all things that we look at when we're trying to identify our past. And as Jude said at the start of this presentation, one of the things that we're doing now is we have an online archive, and that's why it's so important that people can share their stuff with us so that we can share it today with our community today, but safeguard it for the future. I think one of the most famous kind of couples on the Titanic was Archibald Butt and Frances Millet. Archie was a US Army officer, as well as seeing battle. He was also an aide to both Theodore Roosevelt and W.H. Taft. Frank Millet was a painter, a sculptor, and a writer. And as you can see, there weren't two young fellas that'd been together for a wee while. They lived together at Archie's home in Foggy Bottom. And yes, that is a place in Washington. They were very much involved in the cultural, political, and social aspects of high society. They threw large parties where President Taft often attended. While Archie never married, Frank had been, and he was the father of 4 children. Before Archie and Frank got together, Frank had had a relationship with writer Charles W. Stoddard, and surviving letters show this was sexual in nature. And actually, how they came to be on the Titanic was Frank was trying to persuade Archie that they should go away for a while, and Archie was having none of it. So Frank actually went to President Taft and persuaded him to tell Archie to take 6 weeks and go through Europe. And what President Taft actually did was he sent Archie to deliver letters to the Pope and to the French president at that time. But they boarded the Titanic separately. They actually boarded it in separate countries, believe it or not. And they stayed in separate rooms, or at least they had booked separate rooms in first class. Historian Richard Davenport suggested the enduring partnership of Butt and Millet was an early case of don't ask and don't tell. They were together in death as in life, as neither of them survived the sinking. What was interesting for me when I was reading up on these two people, not only was some of the beauty of Millet's work, but also when they died, that they were so well thought of that American Congress authorized the construction of a memorial to them. It's at Ellipse, which is close to the White House, in a place called President's Park. It was sculpted by a really famous sculptor, Daniel Chester French, and it was to honour the two men. As well as the present president does know it's there. The sculptor also very famously later sculpted the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Sorry, I meant to say if you have any questions, please ask them at the end. Apologies. Quite often, lesbian lives are invisible, even within our own community. So I always love to find history that shows love between two women. And again, you can see that these two ladies weren't truly young girls. Ella Holmes White and Marie Grace Young. They boarded the ship together and shared a first-class stateroom. Both women survived, and in fact, this image was of the two of them in 1920. They lived together before and after the Titanic, up until January the 31st, 1942, when Ella died. She left most of her estate to Marie. They were definitely a case of an opposites attract couple, with Ella being described as brash, while Marie, a piano teacher, quiet and gentle. And interestingly enough, Marie taught piano to many, including Teddy Roosevelt's children. So I kind of wondered, did she cross paths with Archie before the voyage, since the both of them kind of had that link to President Roosevelt? I think one of the things that I found really beautiful when looking at these two people was their families' attitudes afterwards. So Marie died around about the early 50s, and her niece said about the two of them, I don't know when I knew, but it seems I always did. Talking about their relationship, the love. As I say, both women continued with their lives after the crossing. In fact, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean 14 times after the Titanic. I'm not sure that I would have, but however. Marie also had a 5-page article carried after the 1912 film, Lest We Forget. And interestingly enough, and kind of a wee bit of another trivia question, the actress in the film 1912, Dorothy Gibson, actually was on the Titanic and survived. And she wore the same dress. She survived the Titanic in the movie. So as I say, a wee bit of trivia for you there. Now, I actually came across, when I was doing this kind of research for this presentation, I came across 9 different people. I chose to only focus on 2 partnerships and 3 friendships. Just for time wise and things like that there. But the 3 musketeers. So the 3 musketeers, Hugo Ross, who's the person on your left. I'm not sure who the person beside him is. The next person is Thomas McCaffrey, Mark Fortune, and Thomas Beatty. And that's in Mark Square in Venice in 1912, March 1912, so just before they boarded the Titanic. Ross and Beatty were very successful real estate agents in Winnipeg. To escape the Winnipeg winters, they often travelled along with Beatty, his close friend Thomas McCaffrey, who was a Vancouver banker. And again, when we're talking about society and societal norms back in the early kind of part of the last century, it was very unusual for close friendships between men of a certain age who weren't married. And we can take a lot of inference from that. But as I say, these 3 people, Ross, Beatty, and McCaffrey, often travelled together. Beatty and McCaffrey were actually described in the press as inseparable. And they often kind of looked and dressed similar. They shared a cabin on the Titanic C6. So as I say, think what it was like when we talk about social norms. Unusual for men not to marry. Yet here we have confirmed bachelors who often in the press also described them as dapper, flamboyant, and witty. I'm not sure why witty is a kind of an idea for somebody being gay, but there you go. They must have been known more wittier men than I do. They were often travel together, and again, the 3 of those men passed away together on the Titanic. I also came across another person who I didn't include. If I had been looking at, instead of looking at gays on the Titanic or LGBTQ plus people on the Titanic, if I had just been looking at LGBTQ plus history on the Titanic, I would have included here a man called W.H. Stead, who was an investigative journalist, although these days we would have probably called him a tabloid journalist. And the reason I would have included him was he kind of caused the arrest of Oscar Wilde. And how he done that was he had wrote an article called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. And his article actually caused riots in the street. It was about child prostitution. The riots weren't because of the abhorrent practice of child prostitution. It was because his articles were so titillating, in a sense that newspapers at those days didn't normally carry things like that, and they had only printed 10,000 copies. and some of those copies actually changed hands up to 20 times. But the riots were caused because people couldn't get a copy of them. It caused that kind of much of a commotion and stuff. Westminster finally took notice of it, and they brought in a law which is called Stead's Law, or sorry, Stead's Act, and it raised the age of consent from 13 to 16. But part of that law also then caused Oscar Wilde to be arrested some months later. And funny enough, this man, W.H. Stead, where he researched for his article was he bought a 13-year-old girl from a chimney sweep. And afterwards, he was arrested and charged and spent 3 months in jail for that. But however, he, and funny enough, in his last letter while on the Titanic, called it a monstrous floating Babylon. Kind of the biblical reference meaning decadent and sinful. But just he had posted a letter in Cork, and that's what Harry described the Titanic. But he also passed away. So sorry, that was me doing a wee bit of digression there again. Sorry about that. Queer coded friendships. As I've said earlier, back in the time of Titanic, in different times, 1968 in Britain, I believe, 1982 here in the north of Ireland, it was illegal to be gay. So we had queer coded friendships, and some of those kind of things was against the social norms. You know, you had Boston marriages, which were usually between two women. And what that kind of meant was when women had really deep friendships and weren't financially independent on men, they were termed Boston marriages, but quite often what they were proper relationships. And even the intimate male friendships, some of which we've kind of talked about. And just a wee article of the Titanic after it was hit with the iceberg. And Titanic in modern day kind of queer pop culture. Interestingly enough, there's quite a number of fanzines that describe Jack and Rose, you know, from the Titanic, the movie, Jack and Rose, his relationship as Jack and Thomas. And quite often they describe a relationship between Jack and Fabrizio, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, which was the Italian person in it. For me also then you have Alonso, who's Captain Jack, who Doctor Who introduced to Captain Jack and in the Night to Remember. So that's just a wee bit of a joke for me there. But I think too that if we look at that's the kind of modern interpretations, as I say, it can include queer reading, the lots of fanzines portraying them as bisexual. Legacy and memory. You know, if we kind of look at the Titanic as the tragedy as quite tragic, but also as resilient. You know, and if we look at our community, you could turn around and say that at times the Titanic is that metaphor, for instance, when we went through the HIV crisis, and for what our community is going through at this moment in time. It can be tragic, that kind of emotional weight of loss and erasure experience by others, but it can also show a kind of thing of our resilience and survival. So for me, that's kind of one of the things why the Titanic is such a part of our culture. Not only just the people on it, but that kind of is that metaphor and that symbolism, sorry. So history isn't fixed. I've no doubt there was more of our community aboard the Titanic than the ones I've mentioned. As I say, I know of 9. I also note that the info that I've been able to get is mostly about first class passengers. It's almost a message that first class passengers and their legacy mattered, but in my interpretation, And basically, for me, that's what history is. It's an interpretation of sources, or in my case, an interpretation of other people's interpretation. Queer history gives us a richer, more inclusive way to understand the past, to understand ourselves, and be visible, and that the whole importance of being visible and seeing ourselves and others. And as I say, particularly at times when our community needs that wee bit of resilience, it's so important to look at the past and say, we were there and we overcame, and we will keep overcoming. And our history matters because it restores the dignity and recognition of lives long hidden. And I'm going to finish on one wee thing, and I'm sorry, I've kind of really rushed through this for some reason. And earlier on, when I was practicing it took me really, really a longer time to read this. Um, and what I had meant to start off with, of course, everyone knows the familiar stories of the Titanic, the mobility of the band playing to the very end, and all of that. But what I'm interested in is the untold stories. So I hope I've told you some untold stories tonight, and I hope I've given you some things to think about. I might very quick run through this. This is some of the references and further reading that I would suggest, some of the stuff that I've looked at over the last couple of weeks. And of course, I am a big Doctor Who fan, and I was nearly putting Doctor Who's Titanic scenes in here, but I chose not to. The Titanic fan culture and archives is really interesting. But be careful, because I also went on to Amazon and put in the search gay Titanic and bought a book. And yeah, I wouldn't be allowing anyone else to read the book, let me just tell you. Gilded Lives, Fatal Voyage is a really interesting book. And in fact, that's where I got the information about the Three Musketeers. But for me, it just focused on the first class passengers and their lives. It didn't really touch on anything of the kind of people in steerage. And in fact, the only thing that I've really read on people in steerage is stuff that I read a number of years ago by Joe Baker. And funny enough, Joe was one of the first people who talked about the gates between steerage, second class and first class being locked while the ship was sinking. And the Titanic, the movie, the James Cameron movie, they actually also make note of that. Outhistory.org is a really interesting thing. It looks at different archives, different exhibitions, and they actually done one on queers on the Titanic. And the hidden histories of the Titanic by the Queer History Journal is another really interesting articles. So anyway, thank you very much. Any questions? And please complete our evaluation. They're really, really important. As well as letting us know if you've enjoyed this. Give us an idea of what we're doing wrong so that we can improve. And also our funders love our evaluations. And Cara McCann, my director's on this call, and she'd kill me if I didn't ask about this. So thank you very much. Just out of another wee bit of information, there was 2,224 passengers and crew on the Titanic, and they reckon approximately 1,500 people died. And that's only an approximation, because obviously the third class and second class, they didn't really take all of their names, and not all the bodies have been recovered. So thank you.
If you would like to make a donation towards our work, just visit www.hereani.org and click the donate button.
Please, it all be there still.
Thanks so much, Mary Ellen. That was really fascinating insight.
I actually feel like I flew through it, but I'm now looking at the time and maybe I didn't.
No, it was really fascinating. Were there any? What was your biggest surprise whenever you were going through the queer history of the Titanic?
The fact that the second class even the second class passengers didn't get a look in, never mind the third class and steerage. There was also I knowing the fact that quite often people have to leave and be their authentic selves back in kind of the turn of the century, right up until probably the turn of this century. Um, the Navy, the kind of cruise lines and stuff was seen as a safe place for our community. So I'm quite surprised that there's kind of no kind of like history of queer crew members.
Do you think that that has changed much with more recent history, or are we still only capturing the history of the famous people and the wealthy?
Jude, as you know, because you hear me saying it all the time, I think that's the beauty of our project. Is yes, we want to capture the Brian Gilmores, but we also want to capture the Ann Davisons, because without both the cogs of our kind of history of where we've got to, the cogs of that struggle wouldn't have got us to where we are today. It's really important that we capture all people's history. Our archive, if you have a magazine article, if you have a photograph, if you have a badge, please take a photo of it and send it to us. We don't even want your original article. If you do have articles and hard copies of things, I would ask you to give it over to somewhere like the Hall Library, Prony, the Ulster Museum, somewhere that it can be safeguarded for the future.
Lovely, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I see Garth. Garth, your hand's up there. You're on. Could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, yeah. I heard that expression. You mentioned the expression Boston marriage. Do you know where that originated from or how that came about?
I actually don't, Gareth. I'm sorry. I presume it was it originated in Boston, but it generally was talked about because, again, if you look at how societal treated women back in the day, they didn't have any kind of financial independence. So when two women lived together, kind of like financially independent of men, and again, it was generally just kind of like middle class to upper class that could afford to do that.
Right.
So I'm assuming that that's where it came from.
Ah, okay. Thanks.
Kirsty?
Yes, Mary Ellen, I really enjoyed that presentation, and thank you so much for putting this together. I never would have made the connect, like, I never would have thought about the Titanic as a queer sort of symbol or a queer icon, but now that you've told us about it, I could definitely see it now. So it's very enlightening. Thank you. But yeah, you were just sitting there mentioning there. I just have to put this in because I'm a big Doctor Who fan myself. I'm especially a big fan of the David Tennant era and the Christopher Eccleston era. Whenever you said about Doctor Who and the Titanic, my immediate thought was the Titanic just flying towards Buckingham Palace. Yeah, make of that of what you will, but yes, I just had to put that out there. So, yes, thank you.
Well, if you can remember when David Tennant, the 10th Doctor, was finishing his kind of tenure there, that he introduced Captain Jack to Alonso, who was the
Uh-huh.
steward of the Titanic. And as I say,
Yes.
they end up having not
Having
a
a wee
fan.
hookup, yeah, a wee hookup in
Yeah,
a bar.
they actually have so like a radio program called A Night to Remember, which is those two getting together.
All right. Okay. I'll
I'll
check
send
that
you,
out.
I'll send you a link to it later.
Please do. Thank you.
Cahill, sorry, Jude, am
Uh,
I taking over from you? My apologies.
No, that's fine. I think Cahill has recently got engaged, and I
Goodness,
know a number of people have suggested.
goodness, did you get engaged? Congratulations, Cahill.
And
for
I
a
have
change, I'm
I've
not even going to be
suggested.
mentioning it. No, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the talk, Mary Ellen. The thing that I really enjoy about the history of the Titanic is that it you can look at it through so many different lenses. So you can look at it even like you did there through the history of the queer community. You can look at it through the history of immigration. You can look
Mm.
at it through a class dimension. You can look at it through a gendered dimension. There's so many different facets of history that you can see whenever you're studying the Titanic. Um, uh, but one thing I did want to say is that when you were discussing the names of the drawings, um, the women were the ones that would have worked in the drawing office as well.
Oh, excellent. I didn't
So
know that, so I didn't.
so they would have I forget sort of the ins and outs of it, but and you know the bigger drawing offices in what's now the Titanic Hotel.
Hmm.
Um, those big lovely rooms with the big massive ceilings with the windows for all the light. The first drawings would have been drawn up uh by pencil with women, and they would have served their time in the drawing office. So the you can look at that through the lens of gender as much as you can. The women that would have been working in, the secretarial roles as well, they were every bit as involved in the construction of the Titanic as anyone that was a riveter or steel platesman.
Mm.
Um,
And I know, well, thank you, Cahill. And the Titanic, that would be an amazing place to get married in, wouldn't it, over there?
uh,
Everybody knew anybody was getting married and had their wedding booked in there. But anyway, thank you. I thought you would enjoy the Harland and Wolff connection.
uh,
Nigel? Hello, Nigel, your hand's up. You need to unmute yourself. Is he away?
I think you might have.
Yep, you have away. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Daria, you're up.
Hi,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, first, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I feel like I have a little bit of a hyper interest in Titanic of late, and as you said, from the event in the Titanic building and everything. So it's really nice to see that project leading on. So thank you so much for that. I just thought I'd mention, whenever I was in Manhattan last year, my cousins brought me to see a fantastic musical called Titanic the musical, which is the queerest telling of Titanic I've ever seen in my life. But it's just been adopted by the West End recently as well. So it's running in London this summer, and it's well worth going to. It's a real so I can't see Titanic as anything but queer after seeing that musical. So it's well worth a go for anyone who's interested in that if you're ever over in London and get a ticket for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant. Any more? Is there someone in the group chat? Yes, Clinton, no, it's great to see the hot weather. It was lovely. I actually done a wee bit of work outside today, some reading. And Cara has put in some context of Boston marriages. Garth, if you want to click that wee link.
I think we've got Nigel coming back.
Nigel, is back with us? Hello, Nigel.
Oh, thank goodness the meeting's not over.
Well, we're waiting for you, my friend.
I'm glad that you have. Well, I really enjoyed that presentation, and just as well that I popped back in just at the same. Oh, hang on. No, we're all right. We're fine. Sorry about that. My tablet ran out of battery there, and I thought, oh gosh, just at the pinnacle of me about to ask questions, and I get put it out of the damn meeting. That was a really good meeting, and that I don't really think I can reflect much more on what some people have already said about the emphasis of how easy it is to have stories like this lost because um, just as who was it who popped the question? I don't mean marriage, but a Boston marriage, funny enough. There you go, there's a double entendre. So a brief search on the origin of a Boston marriage, seeing as I have quite an interest in queer history myself. It would appear to be very indirect, Gareth, and it appears to have come from a novel called The Bostonians. Now, if that's the case, I'll look into it a little bit more. But if that's the case, it wouldn't surprise me if it was an indirect case at all that any queer person would do something like this, because most of the time whenever you're going back in history, it's very, very difficult to stand up for yourself without major repercussions. So if the term Boston marriage had come from a novel, then that's probably a reason to suspect why it had come from such an indirect source. The novel itself was published in 1886. The contents of it, don't know what it's about, but uh, just briefly on books. Thanks so much, Mary Ellen, for adding another book to my collection. It's not like as if I have too much already. But having said that, determination pays off for something because after searching around for months at a time, finally I got my own copy of Threads.
Happy
I got one.
Happy
Yep,
day.
I finally
Brilliant,
got one.
Nigel. Well, thank
Yep.
you for that. Cahill, are your hands up again?
Yep, I'm not defeating the Titanic crazed maniac rumors about me anytime soon. I just remembered as well. I had read a while ago, but when you were talking about the presentations of queer relationships between Jack and Fabrizio, um, there was one I had read as well that was that it suggested that Leo could be the casting of Leo as Jack could be read as using a more androgynous at the time actor, which suggested that you could read it as a trans man. And you can see the thing I read said you can see that in particular in the scene with the unsinkable Molly Brown, where she just happens to have these spare um, dinner clothes that he can wear for the dinner in first class. And there's some that said you can view that scene and how he's being dressed up for this, and certain aspects of their relationship as being a sort of trans man's experience of uh putting on this suit and changing identity and stuff like that. So that was just interesting whenever you said about the gendered relationships aspect of it.
Thank you. Thank you. So any other questions or comments?
Other than saying, well done, fabulous research, very, very interesting.
Thanks, Anne. Really appreciate that. Nigel, your hands up again.
Yes, it is. So, one of your earlier terms that you had covered in the presentation was to do with the term bachelor to describe the Three Musketeers. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
I thought, thank goodness. But that's an interesting term because there's quite sufficient history on the term bachelor. The reason why I say that is because there, once upon a time in the 1920s, was a movement in France called the Anti-Bachelor Coalition or organization, and that was exactly what it sounds like. That was an organization to try and do away with, if there is such a term, bachelorism, because great emphasis was always put on the history of anyone in who would be regarded in the binary as male. So if you were a man, then that was the most important thing to keep safe, to keep recorded, and to pursue. So in the case of the Three Musketeers who were bachelors, how significant do you think we'll be finding stories across the rest of the continent if such a organization, coalition, did exist in France once upon a time in the 1920s, trying to ban bachelorism or at least do away with it? Because it's more of a feminist movement, but
I
there you
kind of
go.
think that you would just nearly look at the church, in families. As you know, I have a big interest in family history. And quite often marriages were arranged to keep land within two families or within even one family at times. So quite often, not only were women forced into marriage, but in some cases, so were men. And particularly too, you would have had a lot of men get married as cover, same way that they do today. Unfortunately, same way as some women do today as well. Just to kind of again not go against social norms, and try not to disappoint families, and for all of those other reasons that people do it. But as I say, in Canada at that time, it was very unusual that you would have had these men that traveling together all the time, I believe Thomas Beattie was 49, and a bank manager. He also, funny enough, owned an estate which he shared with a doctor. And the doctor was not on the ship with him, so who knows? As I say, the kind of historians that have looked into this much more than me have decided that the three of these, going by different things, were definitely members of our community. But I don't know, Jude, and all the times we've read things and people have been described as flamboyant, I've never heard gay men being described as witty. But as I say, maybe I just know the wrong gay men.
Yes, witty's a new one for me as well. Flamboyant, dramatic, confirmed bachelor. These are all of the things that we have to use to decipher whether or not people were part of a community or whether they were outcast from the mainstream.
I think that again that goes back to the fact of we have a hidden history. We were criminalized, and even in cases, particularly of women, when they couldn't be criminalized, they were hospitalized or institutionalized, and that was all to hide us and kind of all of that type of thing. So it's very hard sometimes unless there is diaries or letters on. And I've seen actually when I was doing a bit of research today, I came across I was on Canadian Archives material. I'm raging I didn't write down the bloody name of the book. And Joe, you may take the bloody out of this presentation when you're editing. It was two men who lived together for 60 years, and it was their photographs of their life together. And in fact, they actually fought in World War One together. They actually signed up together, but they had lived together beforehand. But their photographs were absolutely beautiful. And I'm just really sorry that I didn't remember to write down the name of the book. I possibly did in my notes downstairs, but it's not up here. So if I find it, I'll send it to you because it's a really interesting read. But listen, if no one else has any comments or questions, all I can do is thank you for your patience and your attendance tonight and say, please, please, please fill in the evaluations. Some other stuff that's coming up, I think it's really important to mention, is that I see Grania Gibson's in the room with us. Grania is one of the organizers of LGBTQIA Awareness Week. I was actually going to say History Week, but it's Awareness Week, and that's happening around the 12th of May. So please look out in socials for the calendar of events for that. We also have our next film clubs next month, and we will be doing an exhibition in the Linen Museum in Lisburn. And it's called In Their Words. I know a few of you have worked along with us on that. So we're really excited about that. As I say, we'll be throwing stuff out into our social media. So please follow us on social media.
Okay. Michael has just made a comment in the chat, said that there's a musical and one of the lines in it is, I feel pretty and witty and gay. So maybe a connection there.
Well, funny enough, Michael, back to your wee man Stead, the journalist, W.J. Stead, isn't it? Or W.H. Stead. One of the other wee, W.T. Stead, almost right. As I say, that he bought this child, this 13-year-old, and he and his stories called her Lily, and her name was Lizzie. And I'm going to forget the author's name now. Pygmalion. He wrote Pygmalion, which I believe is, the Rain on the Spain that became that.
George Bernard Shaw. That's My Fair Lady's a musical. You're right.
Well, that was they actually based that on what this guy W.T. Stead had done. So, yeah. But anyway, listen, thanks very much, and we'll stop the recording. Sure, we'll